Welcome back to Purely IFS, a show that aims to support therapists and practitioners in using internal family systems as their primary approach with clients. I'm Gail Williamson.
And I'm E Redfern. In today's episode, which is part 1 of 2, we'll be talking about polarisations.
Polarisations are a really useful dynamic to pick up on between parts. They're something I think you may only start paying attention to the more experienced you become in using the model.
Sure. In the beginning, our focus is perhaps on developing our skill in detecting individual parts. But yes, the more experience we get, the more we are able to detect relationships between parts.
Because, of course, this is internal family systems therapy, with one of the ultimate goals being to create more harmony between our parts under the care of the self.
So we're going to talk today about identifying polarised parts, the benefits of being able to do so, and then ways to diffuse the conflict or reduce the divide between the parts. And there's a lot to cover, so there will be a part 2, where we'll also look at addictive processes, a key example of polarisation, and we'll talk about polarisations across systems, including those evident in the wider world. Also, as it's something I'm especially interested in, we'll explore how it's important to attend to polarisations between therapist parts when learning a new model, and between therapist and client parts.
I don't know about you, Emma, but I think it took me a while to start picking up on polarisations. But they're yet another reason to be grateful for Richard Schwartz's model, for just how equipped it makes you as a therapist. For one thing, I'm thinking of the client pre-IFS who may have come to me and described experiencing huge inner conflict. They tried to explain all the thoughts and feelings, and it would all come pouring out, and quite often they, as well as you, would end up confused and overwhelmed, trying to make sense of it all.
Whereas now, as a key first step, we'd be parts detecting. This alone can bring clarity into the room, just by listening for and naming the possible parts we're hearing, including potentially identifying relationships between parts. So naming any dynamic between parts that seems significant, maybe regarding the client's issue or reason for coming to see us. And of course, just like we learnt before we trained in IFS, we are listening for what's not being said. It can be helpful to listen for a polarity that isn't apparent in the therapy room, but may be apparent in the person's everyday life, or may have been to the fore in a certain part of their history, for example.
I also love the clarity I have now when someone comes into me and says, for example, that they have a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, where I can offer them an alternative, non-pathologizing understanding that they likely have a strong polarization in their system between one part that is depressing them and another part that is making them high energy, reckless, or manic. That these parts have likely become extreme in response to significant exile pain. And of course, we'll give more examples. But first, if you were describing to a client or supervisee what a polarization is, what would you say?
I'd say the simplest way to describe a polarization is as 2 dedicated protectors with different strategies for managing inner emotional pain. I mean, that sounds kind of easy, but actually it can be experienced in a more challenging way, like a standoff between 2 parts, which usually shows up in an entrenched cycling between contradictory, often extreme behaviours. For example, one part shows up in overworking, perhaps to the detriment of family relationships, among other things, and the part polarising with the overworker might show up in an attitude of party hard and let your hair down, or binge watch Netflix into the small hours, which also might be perceived by family or friends as a bit antisocial.
And of course, the overworker would be a manager, and the partying part likely a firefighter, with both just continually vying for control.
Yes, And the polarization is partly about attempting to create balance in the system, so one or other of the protectors doesn't dominate the system the whole time.
And of course, one part might only stay in control for a few minutes, or it may dominate for a few weeks or much longer, where I will often see a manager managing largely to stay in control for a couple of months, keeping the person eating only healthy food, for example, not drinking, exercising religiously, doing everything right. But eventually, a firefighter is going to have to force its way in to counter all of that control, or to soothe when exile feelings inevitably break past the manager, and the person finds himself binging on food or alcohol or whatever soothing substance or activity may be available.
And it's also important to hold in mind that this cycling, or what I sometimes call flip-flopping, going back and forth between extremes, is also about maintaining a distraction from or a barrier to reaching the exiles protected by those extremes of protected behaviour.
You give a helpful definition in your Transitioning to IFS book, where you say polarization is the term given to parts or groups of parts in conflict, often showing up as protectors competing over how to protect or avoid an exile. A polarization may become more extreme as each side fears their opponent or opponents taking control.
Yes, the polarised parts, just like all protectors, have each adopted opposing or opposite tactics or strategies in the system that they serve, and that's in a bid to stop exile energy or distress breaking through. For example, the hard-working part does what it does, maybe to avoid emotions or getting emotional. But when it gets tired and sits down with nothing to occupy it, emotions or exile energy might start to rise. And that's when the polarized part may not only seize the opportunity to take control of the system for a change, but it'll do so to prevent any possibility of those emotions or memories, etc., surfacing.
Yeah.
And before we go into things more deeply, I'd like to give a bit of a cooling preamble to what can be quite a heated topic. So first, let's remind ourselves that protectors have positive intentions for their system.
Yes, it can be very easy to lose sight of that.
And second, extreme parts come from extreme environments, not of their creation. Third, parts of polarizations usually feel trapped and without a way out or the means to change things over the long term. And knowing all of this and having compassion for parts caught in a polarization, as well as hope merchanting for the existence and transformational relational resource that is self inside, is what gives us IFS professionals leverage to begin negotiations and the confidence to do so. But more of that later.
Sure. Just to say, I like what you said there, Emma, about how the extreme parts we often meet in polarizations come from extreme environments, not of their own creation. I think that's worth repeating. And yes, how holding that in mind can help us not to get frustrated or impatient while working with these parts.
I'm aware, girl, that polarization between parts we might call a pleaser part and an angry part is very common, often between systems. I'm thinking, for example, of parents where one parent acts compliantly or submissively towards the other, who is outwardly more angry, critical, or domineering. But I think you have a couple of examples from inside a person's own system.
Well, if you think of the person who is dealing with a sick elderly parent, and that parent was perhaps very neglectful of the client as a child, you may first hear the client's pleaser part saying, I want to care for him, I really don't mind doing it, I'm glad to be able to help. But as the pleaser continues talking, you begin hearing it refer to another part that it's polarized with. So the pleaser starts saying, I'm just worried that I might let him down, though. I might forget to do something and maybe end up hurting him. I think I can be quite insensitive and unfeeling sometimes.
And of course, our curiosity here is invaluable, where we're wondering who the I is at any given point. And in this example, I might use direct access and ask, do you or another part let him down sometimes and forget to do things then? Which would be very understandable, by the way.
Yes, or you might suggest that the client asks the pleaser, who does it think will let the father down? Or you could simply suggest to your client, I think the pleaser is talking about another part that might let your dad down. It's unlikely to be the pleaser because, after all, she works so hard and it can't be self. And just with naming this for the client, often the other side of the polarization will come in, perhaps saying, I don't want my life to be all about looking after him. It was always about him when I was a child. He did nothing for us.
And here, Gail, am I right in thinking you're getting some sense of the exiles beneath the polarity that were affected by how Dad was, and who are now being protected in these opposing ways by these two protectors, a pleasing one and a more rejecting, angry one?
Yes, I'd be loosely holding in mind that likely the pleaser is trying to help the client by keeping Dad happy in order to ensure he doesn't get angry. And then the exiles who were scared or shamed by him in the past won't be triggered. And of course, the angry part is also trying to help, just in a different, contradictory way, by trying to get the client to distance from the father, and so in that way prevent exiles scared by him in the past from being triggered.
And I'm aware, Gail, that as we're being curious about the client's parts in a polarity, we're also managing and relating to our own parts so that we don't get caught up in taking sides, and so we can hold our own seat.
Yes, that's very important and useful for the therapist to practice that dual awareness. Another example of a polarization that I come across a lot is the parent with a hardworking manager part who is trying to be the perfect mother or father. Typically, the client will have experienced a lack of parenting themselves when they were young, and now they have a pleaser or caretaker type protector who is doing absolutely everything for their children, long beyond the point where the children are actually able to do things for themselves. And when you ask how this part is trying to help the client by doing this, you learn that ultimately it's trying to give your client a happy family home, something they, of course, didn't have. And in this way, it hopes that the exiles who felt lonely, neglected, and scared amid the early chaos won't be triggered.
Yes, that would be my guess as to why this protector is working so hard. And possibly there's also some sort of unconscious drive in the protector to heal the exiles and themselves by providing this stable, fun-filled, action-packed, opposite type of family life. Almost like an external redo in the outside world that unfortunately is doomed never to work in the way the part wants. One of the reasons it won't work is all this part's efforting is also driven by a need for the love it or the client didn't receive as a child. And my sense is it's hoping these lovingly cared for children will provide that love. And being children, they may do at some times, and at other times, not a chance. And while the protective strategy is so understandable, it's also not fair on the children to have to be eternally loving and grateful, etc. And children don't owe their parents what the parents never had from their parents and potentially back down the generations.
That's right. And also, I think another reason the protector's efforts are doomed to failure is because the parent ends up so focused on meeting the children's needs that their own parts just end up more neglected than ever. And so, with a protector like this, What typically happens is that after a long, exhausting day for the manager of being everything to everyone,
chief cook, bottle washer, entertainer, etc., etc.
yes, and then possibly not even receiving any thanks, probably having to just deal with children being children, the other side of the polarization jumps up.
In the form of that angry part, maybe fed up at the extra stress the extreme caretaker or extreme caretaking is putting on the system, perhaps.
But of course, there's actually a lot more going on here. So if we go into more detail of the sequence of parts here, likely the pleaser stroke caretaker will become depleted and angry itself when the children don't even appear to notice, let alone appreciate all the effort it makes. And what happens next is exile feelings begin to surface, feelings of being not good enough or not important, or of just how different it was for the parent themselves when they were a neglected child who had to do everything for themselves.
Yes, and these exile feelings may appear so briefly that they're not really registered, but they're what really make the angry, polarized firefighter jump in, maybe to push away the present source of hurt, the children, and to counter the pleaser who it sees as weak, pandering, causing all the trouble. But ultimately, the firefighter is acting to distract from or suppress the exile feelings again. And I'm remembering what Schwartz and Sweezy write in the second edition of the main IFS handbook. They say a manager who becomes extreme in one direction generates another manager or firefighter who is extreme in another direction. So we might find the existence of angry mum is directly correlated with the existence of pleaser or perfect mum. And also, as Schwartz and Sweezy remind us, finding out from each part in the polarization what they are concerned would happen if they stopped doing their jobs is a great question in itself to help reveal the exile.
And then, of course, soon enough, the perfect parent protector will regain control because the firefighter has been quite extreme. The perfect parent will likely start shaming the firefighter over its behavior.
Yes, which the client, the person might experience as feelings of guilt or shame and thoughts of, I'm such a bad person, a terrible mother, I'm a failure, I've got no self-control, etc.
But that's the perfect parent reasserting itself. And now it will potentially also be extreme in its efforts to keep the person in the role of perfect mother.
And so the cycle continues. Of course, these are only examples. We're not suggesting they generalize, as each professional will want to slow things down and bring curiosity to the system in front of them as to who is active when, how they show up.
Sure, because really there's no way to be certain that, for example, that it's the pleaser shaming the angry part without actually asking it. It could also be a third part coming in, a critical part that is perhaps allied with the pleaser part and forming a third part of the polarity. And we're going to be talking about polarizations involving more than two parts in the second part of our focus on polarizations. But one person I work with has a particularly strong polarization along these lines, arising from a childhood where there was a lot of fear and neglect. They have exiles carrying a fear of abandonment, a strong existential fear around survival. Their pleaser has gotten in the way of them being able to parent their son, now a young adult, where it's all about giving them whatever they ask for and not putting any expectations on them.
So you mean running a free taxi, laundry, cafe service, and somehow not encouraging independence or a responsibility when they're older to contribute to the household in some way?
Exactly. Doing everything for them so they never learn how to do it for themselves, where the parent is not communicating their confidence that the child or teenager can do it themselves, and instead communicates implicitly that they don't think the young person is capable. So this client of mine, when I make any suggestions along these lines, their pleaser will be quick to respond with something like, I can't do that. Sounds too harsh. It would be like I'm punishing him. But then very quickly the next sentence might be, but you know, you're right. He does nothing. He's such a lazy prick. His room is a mess. Do you know he doesn't even know how to boil an egg? And then it's quickly back to, you know, he had a hard time of it with his father. And he was so grateful at the weekend when I collected him from town in the middle of the night when he couldn't get a taxi. And of course, in between the pleaser and angry parts reactions would be very briefly experienced exile feelings of how punished and abandoned the client had felt as a child, deprived of love and security.
And what you're describing there is that seamless transition between parts we're all capable of, but which as IFS therapists we remain curious about. Like I said earlier, I'll often remind myself and supervisees to stay alert and open to which I is talking at any point. We can't presume, just because we'd like it to be so, that parts will take it in turns to speak about themselves and always introduce the change in speaker.
I'm picturing little parts patiently waiting their turn and announcing themselves to us.
Well, wouldn't that be useful and make our job so much easier?
But it's not like that at all. Sometimes the switch between parts is incredibly frequent and fast. And the more experience you gain as an IFS therapist, the more finely tuned your parts detecting will become. So we might say a bit now in terms of how we can try to diffuse polarizations. In other words, how we help the parts to be less extreme and stop fighting each other.
And we have options here for how we go about it, depending on what the client's system allows.
Yes, and also in terms of the therapist's level of experience. And here we thought we might suggest for listeners a 3-level progression in terms of how a therapist might develop their skills in working with polarizations.
And I guess the simplest approach is for the IFS therapist to hold awareness of the polarization in their mind and lead the client into relationship with first one of the protectors and then the other as normal. In other words, using the 6 Fs and insight. So basically, the client is guided to befriend each part. And we as therapists trust that by helping each part to connect to self and hopefully then continuing on to the exiles that they protect, that this will help take the heat out of their conflict.
Yeah, so for beginners, it needn't feel like another big thing that they have to learn. If they approach it in this way, they are still doing good work. If, however, we want to be a little bit more skillful, so the second option in our suggested progression, we might be able to explicitly name for the client that they have 2 parts in conflict with each other and making each other more extreme. We'll say here that it's a very common pleaser and angry part. We collaborate with the client and ask them which part it feels like we should start talking to first, and they choose the pleaser. Then when we're helping the client talk first to the pleaser, one of the things we'll be doing is watching out for the other side of the polarity coming in, as it often will.
Sure. So where, for example, we get to the 4th F and ask the client, how do you feel towards this pleaser part? And the person replies that they feel so annoyed by how that pleaser can never say no. Of course, what we're hearing there is the polarizing part. And we could name this and say, so this sounds like the part that we're also hoping to spend time with, the angry part. Can you acknowledge how it feels and let it know that we're also going to speak to the part, him or her? But just for now, would it be prepared to sit back and let you continue to talk to the pleaser? And perhaps the angry part can listen while we do that.
Yes, great. And during the befriending process, something that can help is, if it doesn't organically become apparent, We can guide the client to inquire about each part's relationship to the other, or we can get the client to ask the pleaser, is it aware of another part that's angry with it? It usually is. And then we can guide the client to ask the pleaser, and what's that like for you? Or maybe, and how do you feel towards that angry part?
Yes, the pleaser part might respond saying it hates or dislikes the other one. And we can suggest the client reassure the part that we're not here to force change. No part will be made to like or befriend another part against its will. And the angry part is hopefully listening, but we'll probably guide the client to repeat this question and reassurance with it, the angry part, when we switch the focus.
Another important aspect of the negotiations with each part is to inquire about their positive intention for the system. And this really can bring conflict levels down. When each part in a polarization can recognize that it's not personal, the other part isn't just trying to make life difficult for them. So often what we do here is, after first talking to the pleaser and learning how it's trying to help, when we then switch focus to the angry part, we can get the client to ask if the angry part heard how the pleaser was trying to help. Assuming it has, we can ask if that has changed how the angry part sees the pleaser. And if the angry part hadn't for some reason heard what the pleaser said, we can get the client to share the information with the angry part and again just check its response to what it's been told.
I won't go into details, Gail, but I remember one time in my own IFS therapy working with the polarity, and as soon as they each realised they had a similar positive intention, they changed position inside. I had two parts facing off against each other, and organically, spontaneously, they moved together back to back.
It really can make quite a difference, when they're the two parts that had been fighting each other so much, just get that understanding of each other
And they realised they were both on the same team
all along. Yes.
all along.
And then we probably don't have time to go through it, but our suggested third level option is facilitating a polarization dialogue, or a round table or conference table dialogue, where we ask the client to get the two parts together in the same space. Self meets with them and helps them to reach a compromise. Listeners will be able to find details of the polarization dialogue that they simply need to learn in various of the IFS books.
And perhaps just to offer some reassurance here, if you haven't attempted this before, you might have parts concerned that you or the client won't be able to work with two parts at the same time, that this will just be too much. And here I'm going to remind us, IFS professionals, that our parts can often help us most by giving self inside of us more space to lead. Parts can offer information and be consultants from the sidelines. Also, it's often helpful to remind our fearful parts that the clients have self too, who can become accessible for these sorts of negotiations and relationship building.
Yes, I don't think I've ever had a client not be able to do this. And it really is worthwhile work when you see just what a difference it can make in reducing inner conflict and easing any stuckness.
Sure. And perhaps just to say more about stuckness, that's often a sign of an entrenched polarization or even multiple polarizations within a system. And this stuckness shows up in supervisees bringing the same client to supervision over and over and sharing their frustration with us. And if possible, I'll invite the supervisee to role play the client they're struggling with using recalled dialogue so I can get more of a sense of the client's part or parts.
I wonder, could you say a bit more about what that looks like, Emma?
Well, using the example of a client's hard-working or overworking part, say, the therapist and I agree to do a role play with me using direct access.
So I imagine a therapist would have been coming to you over several supervision sessions, saying something like, we've talked to the hardworking manager several times, but it just keeps being so strong. Both the therapist and the client are feeling stuck.
Yes. So for the role play, the therapist as the client might begin, I work hard. A 3-day hen weekend is a long time when he's self-employed like I am. Why shouldn't I take my laptop? It's not like I'm going to take it into the sauna or anything. And I might respond in the role of therapist, so you're not feeling appreciated for all your hard work. Is that part of the upset here? And the therapist, as client, nods, and I continue. And maybe there's some anxiety about 3 days away from work too, which makes sense from what I know of you. After all, the supervisee tells me this part is often in sessions, so I would know how conscientious this one is likely to be.
So I hear you doing some acknowledging of the overworker and validating its feelings.
And then a further intervention might be to ask, also, am I right in hearing you feel like you need to justify yourself?
And of course, you're asking that because you've picked up the defensiveness. And so you then have a curiosity around who is the overworker justifying itself to?
Yes, so I ask, is there someone either on the inside or in the outside world who wants you to let up so they and the client can party and relax for 3 days?
And in that way, you get to the other side of the polarization. And your example also highlights something that's often the case, that one side of a polarity is much more vocal or noticeable than the other.
Yes, in the example from supervision just now, in the sort of society we live in, which tends to favour managers or manager behaviour, the hard worker may often have more airtime, and the let your hair down part might only really be detectable by the justifying reaction of the hard worker.
And just a reminder for listeners that depending on how lively the polarization is, there is always the option to interview the polarized parts using direct access.
Yes, and once the parts feel validated and heard by ourself, it might be easier then to pass the baton back to the self of the client to continue negotiations.
As with all aspects of IFS, there's loads more to say on the topic of polarizations, so we're going to continue next time with polarizations part 2.
Yes, we'll look at 3-part polarizations and addictive processes, as well as polarizations across various systems. Hope you can join us then. Bye for now.
Bye everyone!